Welcome to the Big Money Questions show. I'm Rachel Rickard-Strauss, personal finance editor for This Is Money. This week, will economists be able to see the next financial crisis coming? They didn't see the last one. Has anything changed? And why didn't they see that one coming in the first place? We are lucky enough to have Richard Bookstaber here to talk us through it. He knows a lot about risk. He oversaw risk management at Morgan Stanley, one of the biggest banks, and also Salomon Brothers, and then at two hedge funds, and then went on to the US Treasury, and now is a fellow at the University of California. But most importantly, just written a book, The End of Theory, Financial Crises and the Failure of Economics, the Failure of Economics and the Sweep of Human Interaction. Rick, thank you so much for joining us and talking us through what went wrong and perhaps what needs to be done so that it doesn't happen again. Can I ask you, first of all, back to basics, why did economists not see it coming, do you think?
I think it's because the economists really are missing the essence of what creates a crisis. You know, a crisis is really a deeply human event. It's people interacting in the face of uncertainty, in the face of events that have never happened before. And economists assume that people are basically thoughtless automatons because they start with the notion of physics. They're very proud of inheriting the concept of physics even when they start in the 1800s, and they want people to look like they're basically physical particles that operate mechanistically, and in a crisis, that's just not the way things work.
How does it work instead then? What would be a better analogy, would you say, than particles and physics?
Well, you know, I think a good analogy would be to think of what happens with traffic and traffic flows. You know, you have a lot of individuals going along the roadway. They're heterogeneous. They do different things. Some go fast, some go slow, some are always changing lanes. And yet, when you look at their behavior overall, suddenly you end up with congestion, you know, traffic jams. And it's not like anybody is saying, hey, let's create a traffic jam. It just happens, it emerges from the behavior of everybody. So a crisis is a little worse than a traffic jam, but it's similar in that nobody wants there to be a crisis. People are all doing what they think makes sense, and yet that crisis can occur. And yet, if you model people as all seeing the entire world over them, and they're all running using Waze or some program like that, you know, that's more the way that economists think of things happening. It's hard for them to model something where you get traffic jams in the economy.
So, in a sense then, is it fair to say that something like a financial crisis you simply cannot model?
I think you can't model it using conventional tools because those tools don't, well, with economists and with economics, first of all, they assume that the future looks like the past. In fact, when they estimate a model, they use the past 1 year, 5 years, 10 years to estimate it. But a crisis, of course, doesn't look like the past. It's different. It's not even the same as previous crises because you have new instruments. People behave differently because of their experience. So economists can't really work for that reason because it acts like the world continues on just like it has in the past. And it also can't work because during a crisis, the interactions that people have really matter. See, one of the characteristics of humans, I think there's three things that are really important that come to the fore during a crisis. First of all, they interact, and their interactions change the way other people act.
Just explain that one a bit more, how that would work practically.
Okay, so a great example is a bank run. So you are looking at the world. You have certain expectations. Now you see people all lining up outside a bank, and that alone changes your expectations. You don't know any more than you did before except how other people are acting, and now you change how you act based on the way that they act. And the other thing is that people learn from their experiences. We're not the same now, and we're not going to operate in the world the same way now as we would have before 2008 because now we see things differently. And so that's important. And then the third thing is we create, we invent. So down the road, there's going to be new technology, new financial instruments that didn't even exist now or in the past. And so we can't really build a model that accommodates that.
If it's different then every time, and if we change every time in response to the last one and just general, people do change all the time, technologies change, can we learn from past experiences? Are there lessons to be learned, say, from the last financial crisis as to how we approach the next one? Or is it the case that things change so much that you can't really draw comparisons between one and the next?
Well, there are lessons. You don't want to ignore the past, but you don't want to act like the future will be just like the past. So I think the traffic analogy can be pushed even further to be able to look at how people interact and look at currently and say, how are people acting in the market? Who has a lot of leverage, so if things go badly, they're going to be forced to sell? Leverage. Yeah. So this is
debt.
People have borrowed. Yeah. So a lot, hedge funds are a great example of this. They will borrow money so that their $100 million can buy $300 million of assets. Well, if things go down, suddenly the people who lent them the money say, wait a minute, I want some of my money back because you're getting pretty close to, where you won't be able to pay me back. Now they have to sell. So you want to understand that because that implies how fast people have to sell. You want to know how willing other people will be to buy those positions. So those things change over time, and you can try to monitor that, and it's going to be different now than it has in the past. For example, right now, people are not willing to lend the way that they did before 2008 because they realize things can change very quickly and they may not get their money back in the financial markets. But there's another approach that really, it's different than the way economists think of how to analyze the market. I am sort of a frustrated novelist, and I was trying to write a novel, actually a thriller, although I'll never try to do that again, and I couldn't really develop a plot. And so I went to a very successful novelist and said, how do you do this? How do you build a plot? And she said, there's two ways to do it. One is you start at the beginning, you develop an outline, and now you just fill things up in between. The other way is the headlight in the roads approach, where you see where the next turn is and write that. Now you see where the next turn is and you write that, and for a thriller, that's the way you want to go, because then you always have this sense of uncertainty even in your writing. And a crisis is kind of like the economic equivalent of a thriller. Things change, maybe not day to day, but week by week or month by month, in ways that really you didn't quite know in the past, and you have to accommodate it. So part of the solution is to have a system, have a method that doesn't say, here are the axioms, here's the model, this is the way people act, now let's run with it. It's, I have an approach that can mold itself and change as I see the world changing. And I'm more building a narrative, a story that develops with the way the crisis is evolving, as opposed to saying, hey, I have it all solved, because you can't have it all solved. It's going to change. You have to follow along the path with it.
It seems interesting that we never claim to predict our own lives. It's only by living it that you know what's going to happen. And yet, cumulatively, it seems there's a science behind predicting what will happen to society and our interactions with money, which is human nature again. But I wonder if you're not using economics to predict the future, to write the end of the thriller, but to sort of do it stage by stage, how useful can that be? What would you use that process for then, if not to work out what's coming next and try to mitigate or change or thwart?
Yeah, well, I think what you said is right. You can't solve for life, you can only live it. You don't know where you will be until you go through that path. And one approach, the approach that I'm using, which is called agent-based modeling, and it sounds technical, but it really isn't that technical, tries to follow the paths that people might take, or in the traffic example, tries to follow the path that cars may take. So you pepper the roadway, so to speak, with different cars with different agents. People behave differently. Then in the simulation, you move everybody forward a few seconds. Some people, having seen that the car ahead of them happens to be going slowly because that's the way that person drives, change lanes. You go to the next second, now the person behind that car sees a different environment. So you can still accommodate and look at a world where you have different people act different ways. And if you run the model, whether it's for traffic or for people in the financial market, many, many times, you don't solve it. You can't say this is the way things will go, but you get a sense of a distribution of how people act. So, you can still get a sense of where things might go off the tracks, so to speak. But I think one application of how this can be used and actually help to dampen crises is one reason you get a crisis is some market starts for one reason or another to drop. Because it's dropping, people have to sell because they have margin calls. They're selling drops at
calls, sorry.
Yeah, margin call is, again, if you've borrowed money, like in futures markets, this occurs. If I've borrowed money, suddenly the lender says, wait a minute, the market's gone down too much, I want my money back. Well, the only way I can give you your money back is I have to sell. Of course, when I sell, markets go down even more, and they say, hey, you know how I want to sell my money back? Well, when you sold to give me my money back, the market went down even more, so now I want more, and so you get this cascade. So you can get those types of dynamics occurring in the market.
So things snowball unexpectedly.
Yeah, they snowball, and then somebody has to be there to buy, right? But what happens is when the market goes down and then down more and you get this cascade down, a lot of people who might normally be interested in buying that asset suddenly drop away. I mean, if you may want to buy Apple or Amazon, and if it drops 5%, you say, now I want to get it. If it drops 5 and then 10 and then 15 and 20, suddenly you say, I don't know what's going on, but I'm getting out of there. So you have to have a way to help people understand what's happening. And if they understand that it's just people being forced to sell, with this type of a model, they may be more willing to go in and buy, and that will help stem the cascade that finally can create the crisis.
So a way of explaining to people that nothing has changed to the nature of Apple, what Apple is doing, but the value is dropping because of these mechanisms kicking in, and a bit of probably human nature, fear kicking in as well, and people not buying where they might have otherwise.
Yeah, that's right. You're trying to break the cycle of fear.
Okay.
That the world is not really ending, and you can explain to people the reason the world isn't really ending, and then they may be more willing to go and supply the liquidity, basically buy these stocks or bonds that are dropping for these various non-fundamental reasons.
What do you think needs to change so that next time round we do have economists are able to see the next crisis coming?
I think the first thing that needs to change are the economists. Economics as a profession maybe has gone further than it should have tried to go with the mechanistic approaches that were developed. Keep in mind, what's called neoclassical economics, which is basically the standard economics of today, started actually in England 150 years ago. And it started by borrowing from the mechanistic methods of physics of 150 years ago. Well, physics has moved along, but economics hasn't. The methods that I'm explaining now, they're used for traffic, are also used by physicists. They don't rely on the Newtonian equations that they did in the mid-1800s, but in economics, they've taken those equations, they rely on sort of a deductive, axiomatic, mathematical approach, and tried to push them forward, and they just can't get to deal with the sorts of issues that are inherent in a crisis. So step one is to either change the way economists think of the world, or find, and I think this is happening, a new generation of economists who are willing to do that.
Okay, so you need economists to come along and say, it's not a science, it's not maths. We need to be a bit humble about that idea, and move. This seems to have been at some point a real ideology around aspiring to maths, because that's easier, isn't it? Then you've
Yeah.
got answers.
Well, that's right. You can solve
Yeah.
it, but the world can't, as we said, really be solved, and that's why my book is called The End of Theory. I think for economics, it really needs to be the end of theory. It has to be the end of using mathematics and assuming that we can solve how people behave as the basis of inherent rules of nature. And in place of this theory, we need to use a more humanistic approach, one that can adapt and change in the way that people change.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the approach that I'm advocating is one method for doing that, which is called agent-based modeling.
Okay, which differs, we should just clarify, from behavioural economics, which is something similar in that it acknowledges that people are human and a bit weird and
Yeah.
unpredictable,
Yeah.
and sort of builds in psychology into economics. But what you're talking about is distinct from that.
Yeah, so behavioral economics came about because economists try to have people optimize, and then you look at them and say, oh, they're not really optimizing. The way economists start is they say, I'm going to take people's behavior and embed it in what's called a utility function, which represents a function, a mathematical function of how people behave. And people say, I don't have the right function. So let's look at how people actually behave, and I'll try to tinker around with my function to get it to better match the way people behave. And now I'm going to take it, stick it into my mathematical system, and I'm off and running again. So behavioral economics is just a tool that tries to improve a subset of the economic system. It's not really changing economics. What I'm talking about is different than tinkering with the theory. It's really recognizing that people change, that you have interactions, that people can crowd, that you can get congestion in a way, and you can get stampedes. And that's different than simply saying, I'm going to look at psychology to better represent the function that I'm going to now stick into my mathematical structure.
Okay. I think we have to end, but thank you so much, Vic, for talking us through what we have to do, and I wonder whether it will happen.
Okay.
And thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.